Hello my dear friends, how are you? Welcome, thank you for joining me here. I'm Ariosophy and today I'm back for the, let's call it, third part of the videos I've been submitting concerning the esoteric and occultic origins of the runes, giving in the first video the ideologies of Guido von List, looking here like a garden gnome passing through his third divorce, and his pseudo-Futhark, which has greatly influenced the modern interpretation of the runes for magical purposes, New Age spiritualities, Neo-paganism, and the esoteric meaning of the runes. And on the second part, I have talked about the general cultural, political, and ideological background of Europe in the 19th century, a period of great changes and the factors behind those changes, which were the motivators to establish the ideal of a nation state based on racial ideologies, which by consequence will be reflected in the ideologies which brought to life Guido von List's fantasies on the runes and other subjects such as folklore, mythology, toponymy, and heraldry, which by consequence have created the grounds from which Nazism was born. If you haven't watched those two videos yet, I suggest that you do, please, for a background context for today's video. So, on today's video, let's see how all of these historical factors, ideologies, attempt to create a new Germanic spirituality and other elements previously spoken have affected Neo-paganism. Now, just before we start, very quickly, I promise, I would just like to say that indeed this year is definitely a year of great changes for all of us. We are on the second half or last half of the bridge before entering in the new cycle of humanity's history. However, on a personal level, what I want to say is that indeed I too am passing through some considerable changes in my life, changes that affect others closest to me, of course, but also other people's changes in life, in their life, affect my own. So in short, aside from my own parents and girlfriend's support, friendship and love, I would like to give a special thanks to my patrons whose monetary support has greatly helped me over these past few years, which many of you already know this, right? However, much more so right now, I think, in these moments of great changes and the need for strength of mind and spirit more than of physical strength, my patrons have been of great support, part of the foundations that keep me standing and keep me going. And as such, I may carry on and yet again, hopefully succeed and win some more battles. Thank you, my dear friends. And before I get all emotional and shed a tear, let us start our today's video, if you please. Well, after the Nazi defeat in 1945 in relation to the runes, this led to their discredit, the discredit of the runes, and there was no longer a focus on the runes, since not only were they used as Nazi iconography, but also, as we saw in the previous videos, the fantasies and the esotericism of the runes created at the end of the 19th century were the soil from which Nazism and its philosophies and ideologies would be born. So basically there was a discrediting and abandonment of Ariosophism and by association of runes as a modern phenomenon. Of course, later in the 70s, these ideologies linked to the runes were taken up again and still today by far-right groups. Therefore, shortly after the Second World War, the surviving members of the Guido von List Society reorganized themselves based on the studies of 1936 and resumed their activities, although without the popularity and support of other times. For more information about this society and Guido von List, see the previous videos. For those who may have forgotten some details, it happens to me a lot, or for those who haven't seen them yet, of course. So, after a decade of the end of the conflict, the Second World War, the runes and the theses of Guido List and his followers began to be restored, reclaimed. An important part of this work was done by Karl Spiesberg, a German occultist, Germanic revivalist, and Runosophist, member of the Masonic-inspired occult group Fraternitas Saturni, who from 1955 onwards was the author of texts and courses on divination and runic exercises that revisited the theses of Liszt, Gursleben, Humer, among others, which were discussed in the previous videos, right? However, although Karl Spiesberg distanced himself from anti-Semitism and racism as ideologies and philosophies imposed in the runes, he did not fail to elevate these same ideas, so much so, later in 1976, the Armenian Order, referred to in the previous video, not only brought back the thesis of Guido List and his companions, but also based itself on and was influenced by Spiesberg's work. The racist and xenophobic ideals continue to be there, just in a more or less subtle way. Therefore, after the Second World War, an esoteric runic corpus continued to form that replicated that of the beginning of the 20th century, with more or less rejection of the hatred and fear of the other esoteric Runology that had guided its creation and development, but maintaining many creative traits. However, as these groups that perpetuated these ideals were initiatory or restricted, meaning with a specific limited group of members, an elite, the reach of this information was also limited, of course, and thus it needed a broader context and someone who moved within that context, so that this corpus could be disseminated to a greater number of people, a greater audience, so that it could eventually infiltrate the popular culture of our days. Well, this context, first the context and then the man, this context was Neopaganism, which is obviously a very complex and diverse religious movement whose origins and characteristics depend on the branch or group in question. So for the context of this video, it is not worth going into details about Neopaganism and what it really is, because that is a topic for another time. But just as a general religious movement for now, right? Now, one of the roots of Neopaganism is Romanticism, referred to in previous videos, right? As a movement that is not only aesthetic, but also intellectual, philosophical, with its valorization of nature, especially in romanticization and fantasy of the rural space of medieval times. In many places all over Europe, with the rise of the nation-state ideal, the fascination with ancient religions crossed paths with movements for national renewal, not all of them benign. In fact, as you know, the vast majority of these movements in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century had quite destructive ideals. But there are other neo-pagan groups whose origin lies also, or alternatively, in the romantic interest in the occult and mysticism. And mind you that the first recreations were not necessarily oriented towards the formation of religions that competed with Christianity, but rather towards an aesthetic or symbolic renewal, and it was only in the 20th century that neo-paganisms began to assert themselves in greater numbers as distinct non-Christian religions. The expansion of freedom of worship, the secularization of Western societies, counter-cultural movements, and the emergence of environmental awareness and other factors have all contributed greatly to this. Many neo-pagan movements appeared throughout Europe, especially after the Second World War, especially in the 20th century, right? Some more or less focused on an historical past, with a lot of romanticisms in between, almost always in an attempt to bring back a movement that stood out from the Christian matrix or as a movement that opposed some regime of the time. Now, the example I want to give is England. In England, in the 1950s, a mixture of Western esotericism, Germanic and Celtic folklore and customs was born. It was called Wicca and was presented as the ancient European religion focused on nature and fertility, and after Christianization, practiced by witches, persecuted by the church, and so on and so forth. Ideas that are still quite popular today, but have little history and a lot of romantic and semi-academic theses summarized as pre-Christian religiosity and as fertility cults. For more information on Wicca, I have a more recent video about it, which, although Wicca has been a movement in the making since the early 20th century, it was only from the 1950s onwards, and with major changes in the 1970s, especially through a feminist lens, that the Wicca that we are most familiar with today developed, right? Well, as is obvious, Wicca focuses a lot on the romantic movements, but in reality, the religious universe of ancient pre-Christian Europe was much more complex and diverse than the practices and beliefs of Wicca, and without many of its ritualistic and magical alignments, which owe more to the late Western esoteric tradition than to ancient European cults. Well, Wicca became the most famous neo-pagan religious movement in the West, and many were those who adopted the religious views of Wicca, transporting their past to Wicca. In fact, it was not the historical past that influenced Wicca, but rather Wicca that influenced alternative and never-existing versions of a European historical past in terms of a pre-Christian European pan-religion or a pre-Christian pan-European religion. However, with this lack of historical awareness, this later generated a reaction within Neopaganism itself and led to the birth of a Reconstructionist strand. But that was only in the final decades of the 20th century. Precisely through Wicca and how it influenced modern thought, especially in terms of spirituality, Wicca inspired the creation of new branches of the movement, and thus Nordic, Celtic, and other neo-pagan groups were born, some of which reproduced characteristics of Wicca to varying degrees from the magical dynamics of the 8 annual festivities. With this growth and development of Wicca, but through other strands focused on other cultural groups, came new means of disseminating and expressing neo-pagan ideas, which in turn opened the door for neo-paganism into modern popular culture. Now, it was in this context of popularity of neo-paganism and magical practices that, at a certain point, an American named Stephen Flowers entered the scene, perhaps better known by the pseudonym under which he published his books, Adred Thorson. I've already spoken about him in the previous videos, but also in another video, which, once again, please watch that video for more information on this. But I will now indeed talk about Adred Thorson, adding more information that wasn't expressed in past videos. Stephen Flowers is a man with an academic background, and that should be taken into account as opposed to Guido List. He studied Germanic and Celtic philology, whatever the fuck that means, and in 1984 completed a doctorate at the University of Texas, where he submitted a thesis on runic magic, but his interest in the subject had been going on for several years. He admitted in 1974 that he had become acquainted with Spiesberg's work on divination and runic exercises, and the following year he wrote his first text in which he compiled information extracted from the work of this author, but also from that of Guido List and Gottlieb, and figures that Flowers described as authorities on the subject. And this is already the beginning of a bad sign, right? But well, Flowers has expressed his admiration for these and other authors, occultists and mystics on numerous occasions, and this admiration is in fact evident in Flowers' texts such as Rune-Might, where List and others are described as the most brilliant names of the runic renaissance. And in 1981 and 1982, he was present at meetings of the Armenian Order, thus reinforcing his contact with the thesis that paved the way for Nazi ideals, and that the Armenian Order itself, being a group that revalidated the Ariosophical ideals of Guido von List society. And it was precisely an attempt to continue the philosophies and ideals of racism, xenophobia, and misogyny, which I spoke about in the previous videos. Flowers himself brought to the public an English version translated and edited by him of Guido List's Secret of the Runes. And in the introduction, in addition, of course, to presenting the ideas contained in the work, in the book, he also makes his eulogy, his speech to justify, defend, and praise List and his doctrine, trying to separate it from the racism and anti-Semitism inherent in its creation. He, therefore, devalues the Austrian cultural anxiety and other important historical contexts and reduces List's relationship with the nationalists to a symbiosis of practical interests without any necessary ideological coincidence, just List wanting funds for his work. Very clever, trying to minimize and dismiss the historical facts and List's true racist and misogynistic ideologies to divert focus from the dangerous ideologies he is dealing with in there. Even when Flowers admits that List was racist, he does not accept that this was a major motivation. Now, like all of us who know the story and the history and read the sources and know List's motivations, I mean, Stephen Flowers is quite aware of List's ideologies. He just refuses to accept them, simply dismissing important facts in order to continue promoting the ideas, which is, in essence, an effort to exculpate, perhaps because, like Spielberg, there is a fascination and admiration for the creations of List and his disciples. After all, Flowers describes List's temporary blindness as a spontaneous runic initiation. Well, Stephen Flowers knows well, and he himself has already admitted, that there is an awareness that in the post-Second World War period, these creations, fantasies, and ideologies linked to the runes as a modern phenomenon could not be presented without being properly cleaned, that is, separated from their supremacist genesis. What List and others imagined and invented is therefore present in Stephen Flowers' works. From runes as an expression of universal laws, ideograms or sacred symbols that hide cosmic secrets, to the myth of the initiatory guild that preserved and transmitted the mysteries of the runic characters. So much so that Flowers argues that the evolution of runes occurred in a traditional and therefore controlled religious context, justifying this idea with supposed stability in the order and symbolic correspondence of the runic characters, which, as I mentioned in previous videos, has no historical or rational basis. Flowers also goes on to describe the swastika as a runic glyph, and like List and his disciples, sees runes everywhere, from the beams of wooden houses to the modern peace symbol to heraldry and even the caduceus. Nor does he neglect the runic gymnastics created by Marby, which I've mentioned earlier and on a previous video. And in all this, Flowers has at least the merit of recognizing the modern origin of these and other ideas and fantasies about the runes. But that's really just that, because at the same time that he does this, more or less, he also attributes to these inventions and fantasies a historical or comparable value that they do not have and never had. For example, in his book Rune Might, List's pseudo-Futhark is listed side by side with genuine runic alphabets, as if it had equal status. And in this book, he acknowledges Marby's role in the creation of runic postures, suggesting that the practice still has roots in the magical postures and gestures of the ancient Indo-Europeans. I mean, I admit, when I was still a teenager and had my first contact with the works of Stephen Flowers, Edward Thorson, and other authors influenced by him and by List's theories and fantasies, that I also like many of you, believed and studied and tried to apply this esotericism. But over the years, and studying the runes as they are and their true historical past, we have come to very different conclusions, and we understand what these authors wanted and continue to want to perpetuate, and you have the right to know this. The belief in the historical value of these and other ideas comes from an appreciation and admiration of Liszt's methods. At least in his edition of The Secret of the Runes, Flowers is clear in saying that it would be very easy to criticize, from a scientific point of view, the way in which Liszt arrived at his thesis. But instead, he finds it more honest to classify him as someone who used intuitive methods and developed arcane techniques to arrive at deeper readings. Thus, without any critical analysis or skepticism, he continues to perpetuate dangerous fantasies and ideologies. So it is not surprising that Stephen Flowers followed in the footsteps of Liszt and his disciples, popularizing an interpretation of the 9 worlds of Norse mythology as equivalent to 9 levels of individual and cosmic consciousness, much to the taste of the theosophical relationship between micro and macrocosmos. And that, based on this, also like Liszt, he, Flowers, has set out towards all types of intuitive correspondences of a symbolic, esoteric, and eclectic nature. I must say this, this does not mean that Flowers is racist and anti-Semitic, mind you. I cannot accuse him of this without having more facts, since it is possible that he is one, indeed, by perpetuating these ideologies and being very much aware of them and doing this on purpose, but it is also possible that he is not necessarily so, since we only have the evidences of what he writes and his thought, what he thinks about in his books, even though he has openly promoted the European New Right, a far-right movement. So, is he racist and has supremacist ideals? Maybe not necessarily. But it could be someone fascinated by an occult system created by people who, in fact, were followers of racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, and anti-Semitic theories. Such fascination justifies an argument contortion that tries to separate the ideas of Liszt and others from their supremacist and intolerant roots. Flowers does not see himself in the misogyny and conservative values of Liszt and his companions, that much seems to be true, yet distinguishes himself from them by opting for the 24-character historical Futhark instead of the 18-character runic alphabet or pseudo-Futhark. However, we really do not see any clear criticism of Liszt's ideals nor any real focus on the historical past that gave rise to runic esotericism and occultism from his part, from Flowers' part, and he does not claim that these ideologies are fantasies provoked by a political and cultural climate. Quite the opposite, in fact, because he tries to continue to promote these fantasies as something historical about the runes. And mind you, his speech is not neutral. His discourse is simply to avoid exposing the enormous amount of historical facts and to avoid a truly academic critical analysis in order to continue promoting, in a more subtle way, Liszt's fantasies and ideologies. It is important to say that, despite the esoteric and occult past of the runes that came to promote dangerous racial and supremacist ideals, not everyone who uses the runes is racist or has supremacist ideals, because the vast majority of people who today use the runes for esoteric or spiritual purposes or in their general spiritualities are not aware of the esoteric origin of the runes and simply continue to follow these discourses and these ideas and meanings without looking into the origin of these same ideas. So, in conclusion, what Flowers did or does is not esoteric runology, much less academic runology. It is not historical. Stephen Flowers perpetuates many of the Germanic nationalist fantasies which leads his work to be a form of Ariosophy, with a runic focus, and therefore a system that is more accurately called Runosophy. That's his job. Intentionally, for political and ideological reasons, or out of fascination with this thesis, Stephen Flower's work is Runosophy. And this is very, very different from Runology. When people say he is a Runologist, I disagree. He is a Runosophist. Stephen Flowers is a clever, smart man, since he used Neopaganism and this need and even anxiety of Europeans and descendants of Europeans to find a magical past in their ancestry, a pagan past with roots in magic and mystery. Stephen Flowers took advantage of the romantic nature of Neopaganism to promote Runosophy. And through Neopaganism, he managed to disseminate these ideas and make them so popular that they became almost unquestionable and taken as the truth. I was 15 years old when I started taking my first steps in paganism and consequently also in the runes. And there were a lot more books on the esotericism of the runes than academic ones. This is still true today. And of course, Stephen Flowers being the most well-known and promoted, I read everything he wrote. Today I am 36 years old and I am making these videos so that you can understand the origin of the esotericism and occultism of the runes. It took a few years of much study about the runes and a lot of reading from many sources and also from the history of Europe in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And it took reading and talking to many other authors, academics, teachers, a lot of research to understand these fantasies and ideologies in the runes. In the esoteric Runology, esoteric Runosophy, that often passes for historical content even though it is not. Far from it. But you have the right to know this and understand it. What you do with this information is up to you. We have to take into account that for a set of ideas to become common and be considered obvious and taken as the truth, it is not enough to write a few books. It is essential that they become popular, which Stephen Flowers' works undoubtedly are. And Stephen Flowers and his books have had a profound impact on Neopaganism. You see, in 1980, as mentioned in an older video I made, he founded the Rune Guild, a Neo-pagan initiatory group that harks back to the guild that, in Liszt's oft-repeated fantasy, preserved the mysteries of the runes. The Rune Guild was naturally a vehicle for transmitting ideas, creating a school of thought, and generating followers, one of whom was the editor of the Neo-pagan newspaper, Tuir. Stephen Flowers contributed to it regularly and was also part of two Neo-pagan organizations, the Ausotru Free Assembly, the Ausotru Folk Assembly, as it is known now, and the Odinic Rite, both of questionable Nordic content, and draw your own conclusions regarding, at the very least, the Ausotru Folk Assembly. Stephen Flowers, in 1993, also created his own publishing house, Runa-Raven Press, which operated until 2012 and published not only his own texts, obviously, but also those of Liszt, Liebenfeld, Kummer, and a man named Rudolf von Sebomdorf, who was the founder and leader of the Thule Society and thus another ideological harbinger of Nazism. And with popularity and disciples came the reproduction of ideas by third parties. This is the case of Stephen Grundry, the Neo-pagan author under the pseudonym Kveldhulf Gundarsson, and Elizabeth Huishu, known as Freya Oswin, who also joined the Rune Guild. And if Flowers' works had, and still has today, wide circulation in the Neo-pagan universe, then it was inevitable that sooner or later impressions, ideas, or elements of his works, would pass to the general public. Thus, a set of ideas emerged that, due to their origins and content, assumed a predominant position in Neo-paganism and, from there, a profound presence in modern popular culture. The notion that runes are magical symbols or sacred ideograms, tools of sorcerers, wizards, witches, or ancient priests and priestesses, persecuted by the church and whatnot, was created and asserted on as obvious and natural, not because history says so, but because this was how it was imagined in the 19th and 20th centuries by those who shaped fantasies to extract security, legitimacy, and feelings of superiority from them. And then there were those who took hold of them and, as a fascination, perpetuated and magnified them, making them common knowledge, but with a whitewash of past legacies. Liszt and Flower's pseudo-history has been prevalent for too long, far too long, and it is necessary to deconstruct this so that the runes can be seen and studied as they really are. And even in spiritual terms, people indeed need to be aware of this so that such ideologies do not influence their judgment and perception, especially their perception of the world and towards the other. Even in spirituality, or mostly in spirituality, freedom is necessary for people to build a connection with the spiritual and not be closed off in ideologies that have nothing to do with either a historical past or spirituality. Again, with this information, do as you please, but I do hope this was useful, at the very least. My dear friends, thanks so much for watching. See you all in the next video, and as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.